morning, everybody, and thank you, Phil, for that lovely introduction. You'll be happy to know I'm just here very briefly today to introduce a couple of amazing, or three amazing people. Some 2 years ago, the FDA, in association with Cinema First, commissioned an industry tracker as we kind of sought to get ahead of the game to understand the changes the pandemic was wreaking on our customer base, and more importantly, to understand how people felt about cinemas and coming back to cinema in general. So 2 years on, the tracker is still going, I'm happy to report, and Cinema First now, working cross-sector with some wonderful people across the industry, are continuing to run the tracker, and it's proving a really vital source of information as we really try and plan for a healthy return to cinema. Without further ado, somebody that has been in it for the long game, I'd like to introduce you to Daniel Braithwaite from Metrixlab, and to take you through the latest tracker, which we haven't released yet. So Daniel, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon, and also thanks so much for the UK Cinema Association for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to just say that it's a delightful experience presenting in front of real people for a change. But do forgive me if I fall into some old habits. Can everyone hear me? Can you see my screen? So as Sharon introduced, we've been working together with the UK Cinema Association for about 2 years now, with the objective of really trying to see through the eyes of the pandemic potential cinema goer and understand their experiences and their perceptions and their barriers towards cinema going. So really seeking to corroborate and build upon some of the information that Lucy from Comscore has already brought to us. But how do we do that? Well, primarily, first of all, by just interviewing a load of people. So we interview people across the UK and Ireland, across a real broad range of demographics, from teens aged 13 through to adults aged 75. And we also include parents within that as well, parents of kids aged 4 to 12. So a real broad variety of potential cinema goers that we're interviewing. It's an online survey, 20 minutes in length. And one of the key factors to actually get into the survey is that in normal circumstances, you have to be a cinema goer who goes at least twice a year. So we're talking at real potential cinema goers here in a normal year. But we spoke here last time in October at the UKCA conference, and as Sharon mentioned, we've been running this research for a fair amount of time at this stage. So I just wanted to review some of those key headlines before going through the more recent results. So at this time, in October at the UK Cinema Conference last year, we were seeing that the relaxation in restrictions drove a significant growth in numbers of people attending the cinema. To steal a phrase from Sir Kenneth Branagh, if you build it, they will come. If you open it up, we're finding that people will come. Despite that though, and despite some promising numbers of people returning to the cinema, COVID was still a real strong concern for people. I think around, 73% of people highlighted that COVID was still the strongest barrier they faced in considering a return trip to the cinema. So there was some, significant elements that we have to overcome in inspiring greater attendance in future. As restrictions were eased, and I think we could all remember Freedom Day when restrictions were relaxed with regards to indoor entertainment. But what we did see related to that was that there were safety concerns associated with indoor leisure, things like going to the pub, things like theatre, with cinema involved within that as well. Although cinema was quite well placed as one of the safest perceived indoor leisure activities. So it did appear that cinema was quite well placed to actually benefit from the easing of some of these restrictions. And then finally, we saw that we really had a big job to do in terms of educating potential cinema goers. Not least just informing them when their local cinema was reopening, but also informing them on what they could expect to find when they did decide to return. Are things like mask wearing enforced? Do they need a COVID pass? All of these sorts of questions that were not clear to us in 2019 was something that we really needed to talk through and educate our potential cinema goers. And last but not least as well, just educating the potential cinema goer about what to expect on screen. We saw slate knowledge actually at this point of time wasn't necessarily as strong as it could have been. So as Lucy mentioned, that really exceptionally strong pipeline that we had, there was just perhaps a job to do in terms of getting that in front of people's eyeballs and enticing a little bit of a recovery. But just to briefly go over our strategically selected waves between the previous UKCA conference to now. After that previous UKCA conference in October, we decided to conduct another wave of the tracker to try and pick up the impact of some of those high-profile titles. Just a few kind of mentioned on here, Shang-Chi, No Time to Die, and Dune. But also, around this period, a couple of key headlines that were coming up. The Omicron variant was starting to hit the headlines a little bit more frequently and a little bit more often, and we heard murmurs of government's response in reaction to some of that. And then we conducted another wave in the lead up to Christmas, also preemptively trying to get a gauge of the cinema audience prior to Spider-Man's release. And this also coincided with the announcement of Plan B restrictions in England, with similar restrictions coming into place around mask wearing and the need for COVID passes across the UK region and in Ireland too. Then, around January, we wanted to pick up the impact that Spider-Man perhaps could have had, and the Christmas impact as well over this period. And also around this time, Plan B restrictions were repealed, so we wanted to pick up the impact of some of those factors as well. And as kind of Sing 2 and The Batman were releasing, we've conducted our most recent wave of fieldwork, Wave 14, and this coincides as well with the easing of all restrictions in England, with Scotland, Wales and Ireland also looking to follow suit soon. But what do all of these factors, or how have all of these factors impacted the level of cinema going that we picked up in our survey? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, when you build it or when you open it, they will come. We saw really strong evidence that that was the case. Freedom Day, or the easing of indoor leisure restrictions, drove a double-digit growth in the number of people who claimed they returned to cinema between June and August last year. And then the releases of those high-profile titles, bringing cinemas back to the audience, kept up the momentum and drove another double-digit significant increase in cinema attendance. Ooh, a clicker. And that's where we start to see things level off slightly. So despite the Plan B the restrictions coming into place, the total number of cinema goers wasn't dramatically increasing in the way that we were used to from the previous 2 or 3 waves. However, we do see a more gradual increase in the number of people claiming that they've attended the cinema by virtue of some of those great titles like Spider-Man and also Sing 2, particularly effective at bringing the family audience back to the cinema, and also The Batman. And also the dropping of all restrictions has helped to that end as well. But we were led with this question, or we were left with this question, I should say, about understanding what's driving this softening of an increase in the number of people who've reattended the cinema. And first of all, it's not all bad. Whilst we do see that impact in the blue line that I saw on the previous slide, this slight levelling off the number of people who've claimed they've returned to the cinema, we are increasing the frequency of cinema attendance within that. So we see a similar pattern in terms of people claiming that they've been to the cinema twice or more, real strong increases relative to the easing of restrictions and the releases of high-profile titles. And whilst the total pool of individuals returning to the cinema hasn't increased dramatically, we are seeing a dramatic and significant increase in the number of times people say they've returned to the cinema. So we are kind of waging a war on multiple fronts here. We're trying to engage people to return to the cinema who maybe haven't already been, but we're also trying to stimulate frequency of attendance, and we're doing that extremely effectively with the titles that are releasing. One of the ways that we can try and delve into and understand this plateauing effect that we've seen is by looking at demographics. So we can see here some of that data around attendance split by different groups of people. We have teens on the left-hand side all the way through to parents on the far right. The yellow bar indicates people who said they have returned to the cinema. The blue bar indicates people who know they want to return to the cinema, but they're just not sure when they'll return to the cinema. And the grey bar indicates people who are uncertain when they want to return to the cinema. The tiny, tiny purple bar indicates people who are unlikely to return to the cinema. So there's really good news in that amongst frequent cinema goers or potential cinema goers, that we're not losing a large number of people. And in fact, as the pandemic rolls on, that number of people who we've lost appears to get smaller and smaller. However, this does give us some indication about potentially why that number of cinema goers has plateaued slightly. We see relatively strong levels of attendance amongst teens, all the way up to 44-year-olds, but particularly very low levels of uncertainty about when they want to return. They know they want to return, they're just kind of waiting for that right film, they're just waiting for the opportunity to go back. When we look amongst 45-plus-year-olds, we see not only a little bit more of a sporadic picture in terms of actual attendance, but also significantly higher over-indexing levels of uncertainty about when they want to return. So I'm not going to delve into the reasons behind 45-plus-year-olds' uncertainty too much in this session. Red Sea, who are talking after me, are going to delve into that in detail and really kind of bring a clear picture around that. But this is one way in which we've been helping to try and identify some of the factors and variables that will help kind of support and stimulate recovery in future. Another way we've tried to do that and identify some of the key barriers is by looking amongst those who are yet to return and splitting them into distinct groups. So we have 3 key groups to help us understand a little bit more about the barriers that individuals face who are yet to return. We have the orange intender maintained. These individuals are certain they want to return to the cinema, and they want to get back to their normal level of cinema going, or in fact, go more often than before. Then we have intender reduced. These people are certain they want to go back to the cinema, but they feel like they'll probably have a lower level of attendance than they had prior to the pandemic. And then finally, we have the unsure group. They're mainly populated by that grey bar on the previous slide. They're not certain whether they want to attend the cinema at all in this post-pandemic world. We have a series of specific barriers to better understand these 3 key groups who have yet to return to the cinema. You can see them all on the left-hand side of this slide. They generally fall into a number of different barrier categories, with COVID still being a key one. That top barrier there, I'm worried about the risk of catching coronavirus, through to financial concerns, things like I can't afford a trip to the cinema, and then key things around cinema and the cinema content on offer, things like there's enough to watch on TV or streaming, or there are no films I'm interested in seeing. And you can already see, just by the overall pattern in the barriers of these 3 key groups, well, firstly, that amongst intender maintained, they under-index versus almost all of these barriers. And the strongest barriers for them are primarily around the content on offer at the cinema. They're really close to conversion at this stage. So there is a number of people who've yet to go to the cinema that are really just outside the door. We just almost need to give them that push to get them in. And whether that's the right film or, just creating a distinctive, unique experience for them to really kind of drive that conversion, they're close and there is an opportunity there. For the intender reduced, it's a little bit more complicated. So they tend to over-index in terms of financial concerns. We've also seen that this group is more likely to have their living situation changed by virtue of the pandemic. A change in jobs, more working from home, being displaced or changing the location that they live in due to some of the pandemic. So these really are our cinema lovers that are almost restricted by environmental factors from getting back to the cinema. And as you can see, they're just slightly over-indexing in terms of financial concerns and also having changes, prioritizing changes in their lives. And then finally, save the best to last, the unsure group. And really here it's a battle on multiple fronts, unfortunately. This group over-indexes in terms of the number of older people in the group, which perhaps isn't a surprise. And for this group, COVID still remains a primary concern for them. So providing reassurances around the safety within cinemas will be a priority in order for, it's a hygiene factor, I suppose, forgive the phrase, a hygiene factor in terms of showing them that cinemas are safe and giving them the outward perception that it's a safe place to return to. But this group also, unfortunately, is more likely to state that they're facing financial concerns, or also that they face changes in terms of their personal lives. And providing, I suppose, a good knowledge or a good communication of the slate and what they can expect to offer, the right kind of film, will also be really important for them. And I'd love to say, essentially what we've seen in our tracker is that concerns over COVID are gradually decreasing, but with all of the news now around the rise in the cost of living, we're almost seeing this concern pass the baton over to more financial concerns or changes in people's individual circumstances and lifestyles. So whilst we are seeing for a couple of groups that financial concerns and prioritising changes in my personal life are significant barriers, but we've also seen that grow wave on wave as well. It's not all doom and gloom though. One of the most effective factors we've seen in stimulating confidence is really just getting people through the cinema doors. So there are 3 donut charts here. The leftmost donut chart gives an indication of people's satisfaction with the cinema experience. And what we can see in the dark blue bar and the light blue bar is levels of very good and good experience. Over 96% of our returning cinema audience stated the experience good or very good. So when we do get cinema goers through the doors, they generally, more often than not, have a really, really strong experience in the cinema. Also, they're massively reassured by the safety standards on offer, again, when we're able to get them through the doors. So 68% were very satisfied with the safety standards on offer within their local cinema, with an additional 29% being somewhat satisfied. So again, close to 100% satisfaction on the level of safety standards on offer in the cinema. And then finally as well, the kind of word of mouth factor comes into play significantly as well. Just as Lucy from Comscore said, taking someone to the cinema, I think we're hoping to see a real driver of cinema frequency and cinema attendance. And those recommendation scores really speak for it all. We asked people, would they recommend returning to cinema, or would they recommend cinema to a friend? And 96% said yes as well. So that's everything I wanted to talk you through today. Hopefully giving a little bit of a perspective into the cinema goer to accompany some of the data that Lucy brought forward.